March of Time.
Profound enigma to most people of the Western world has been the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a nation which occupies 1/6 of the Earth's land and includes nearly 1/10 of its population. Little more of Russia has been seen than a few glimpses of Moscow, show window of the Soviet Union. For the Russian government releases only the most carefully selected and thoroughly censored pictures. But in early 1947, back to London came a British cameraman, Peter Hopkinson, who had been assigned by UNRWA to accompany missions sent into Bielorussia and the Ukraine, missions which had been given full freedom of movement to check on relief activities. With him, Hopkinson brought back exclusive and uncensored films of life inside Russia, enabling the March of Time to present factual pictures of the Russians nobody knows. Cameraman Hopkinson began his job of documenting UNRWA operations in the Soviet Union at the Black Sea port of Odessa. Through this port during 1946 alone, UNRWA delivered the major portion of almost $250 million worth of supplies, more than 2/3 of which were such essential consumer goods as food, clothing, and medicines. To give the Russians a start toward the restoration of their devastated land, UNRWA also sent in the heavy goods most urgently needed for industrial and agricultural rehabilitation. Delivered for the most part in British and American ships, all supplies were turned over to the Soviet government at the port of entry. For in accordance with UNRWA procedure, distribution has been carried out by the Russians themselves. Following up the chain of distribution, cameraman Hopkinson moved on into the heart of the region which had suffered most from the war, visiting Kiev and other cities left in ruins by the Germans. Everywhere he found the Russian people reduced to an existence in which the procurement of the barest necessities was a constant problem. In government-rationed food shops, of which Kiev has but one for every 2,000 citizens, virtually all available items except bread and a few costly luxuries were UNRWA foods, rationed and sold at fixed prices. Meats and fats were the most sought after of the foods obtainable. Bread, principal item in the Soviet diet, was sold not by the loaf, but by daily rationed weight. To obtain their allotted food supplies, customers were required to trade always at the same place. In the city of Minsk, Hopkinson visited the Atolmod, or fashion center, where a Soviet workers' cooperative is converting into clothing UNRWA materials from the US, Britain, and Australia. In such makeshift shops, carrying on the work of factories destroyed during the war, men and women were once more producing on a modest scale consumer goods long scarce in the Soviet Union. In the Red Shoemaker Cooperative, 70 worker members were laboriously fashioning boots and shoes by hand out of leather supplied by UNRWA. Handicapped by the lack of modern machinery, this shop was turning out barely 4,000 pairs of shoes per month to be sold through retail trade organizations. In Kiev, Hopkinson found on sale in clothing shop number 23 articles made in the Soviet workshops, as well as some finished merchandise supplied by UNRWA. As strictly rationed as food, clothing is uncompromisingly utilitarian, designed more to meet the rigors of a Russian winter than to please the customer. During Hopkinson's stay in Kiev, an election of deputies to the Supreme Soviet of the Ukraine was held. Newspaper space for weeks before the election was filled with discussion of the relative qualifications of the candidates in the various districts. But when the voters went to the polls, they found on the ballot only one name, that of the Communist Party's choice, which they could either leave there or strike out. It so happened that the name selected for the ballot in the district photographed by Hopkinson was Joseph Stalin. Ballots with his name could be dropped into any one of 5 boxes. Soon after the election, Hopkinson left Kiev for the countryside. Everywhere he found the Russians well acclimated to the bitter cold which had played so large a part in defeating the German invaders. To temperatures which sometimes dropped to 40 below zero, Russian children were well adapted, enjoying their winter sports, among the most popular of which was spearing fish through the ice. Hopkinson filmed the winter work of some of the collective farms in the Ukraine. Although the rich soil of the Ukraine in pre-war years produced much of the food consumed throughout the USSR, he learned that during 1946, not enough was raised to feed even the Ukrainians themselves. For the war created a shortage of everything needed to operate a farm. To compensate for the lack of manpower, women have taken on more work and now do 75% of the farm labor. But it will take years to make up for the loss of 2,800,000 horses during the war. With abnormal drought adding to their difficulties, collective farms last year reported less than half of their pre-war yield. Under the Soviet collective farm system, the age-old dispute between peasant and bureaucrat still continues. For each farm worker, the government has set a minimum compensation, either in money or in a share of the produce, but nearly always in both. Exceptional workers like Luba Volkova, who last year harvested more potatoes than any other worker on her farm, get a correspondingly larger share of the farm's total earnings. Under the Soviet system, all machinery used on the collective farm must be rented from a machine tractor station operated by the government. About 20 farms may be served by a single shop, where tractors, plows, and reapers are kept in repair and let out in exchange for a share of each farm's output. Everywhere Hopkinson went, he found signs that the religion St. Vladimir brought to Russia in the 10th century had survived the campaign of opposition which the Soviet state had waged against it for over 2 decades. During the war, the Soviet government developed a new interest in the Orthodox Church after the late Patriarch Sergei had called upon all the faithful to aid the communist state in the struggle against the German invaders. Today, religion is renascent among the Russians. On Christmas Day, Hopkinson witnessed an outdoor service at a rural Orthodox church, and on a Sunday morning, Mass at a parish church in Minsk. But he learned that while the Soviet government permits freedom of worship, the Communist Party effectively discourages any religious activity by its members. Throughout Throughout the areas he visited, Hopkinson found that reconstruction of schools had been among the first post-war concerns of the Russian government, which considers education of the young a matter of prime importance. Most Soviet children between the ages of 7 and 15 must attend an elementary or secondary school like number 23, which Hopkinson visited in Minsk. Here he found the Soviets busily reschooling children whose education had been interrupted by the war and the occupation. The primary foreign language taught throughout the Soviet school system today is English. Grade school education is free, and many qualified pupils receive advanced training at various universities and institutes. Today, Russia's need for trained minds to carry out the tasks of reconstruction is limitless. Skilled engineers and technicians, of whom thousands died in the war, are particularly needed. At the Kiev Polytechnic Institute, Hopkinson found some 3,500 students, many of them former soldiers in the Red Army, studying various branches of science and engineering. Upon completion of their courses, these students will be sent out by the government to help in rebuilding homes, industrial plants, and other facilities destroyed during the war. Many technical journals used in Soviet universities, Hopkinson found, were up-to-date issues from the United States and other English-speaking countries. Though its main concern is with the technical arts, the USSR does everything it can to keep the fine arts going. The state, considering it the part of wisdom to provide Soviet citizens with various means of relief from the hardships of life, gives special encouragement and support to the opera and the ballet, in which Russians have traditionally excelled. At the Kiev State Opera House, built under the Tsarist regime, Hopkinson attended a performance of a classical ballet starring Vasilyeva, acknowledged prima ballerina of the Ukraine. Documenting the social welfare program of the Soviet Union, Hopkinson first visited the Dom Invalidov, or Old Folks' Home, on the outskirts of Kiev. Here, old women who have no relatives or friends to care for them are looked after by the state. Those who are able to work, regardless of age, earn their keep by repairing used clothing, donated to United Nations Relief by such organizations as the American Society for Russian Relief and British Quaker Relief. Throughout the Soviet Union, free medical care is provided by the government at institutions like the Clinical City at Minsk. When a worker reports sick, his trade union and his doctor are obliged to follow the case through until the patient is able to go back on the job. Though there is still a critical shortage of drugs, patients in hospitals have first call on whatever medicines they need, free of charge. Almost half the drugs in use today in the areas Hopkinson visited have been supplied by UNRWA. Soviet physicians, half of whom are women, are required to take a 6-year course of training. At the Clinical City, Hopkinson found a small group of medical students in training under a surgeon of great reputation and preeminence in Soviet medicine, 76-year-old Professor Evgenia Koshits. During the war, hundreds of Soviet hospitals and other medical facilities were destroyed. With what is left, the USSR is attempting to restore to health and usefulness thousands who are suffering from tuberculosis and other diseases growing out of malnutrition. One of the greatest human problems Russia has had to face has been the care of Army veterans, hundreds of thousands of whom were disabled in the war. Disabled veterans are supported by the state from the time of their discharge until they have been rehabilitated and settled in jobs. Lacking a modern plant for the manufacture of artificial limbs, all such appliances were slowly and laboriously fashioned by hand, partly out of materials furnished by UNRWA. Among the more fortunate veterans already fitted is Lieutenant Vladimir Kardashev, who even so had to wait 3 years. Most favored in the Soviet scheme of social welfare are the children whose parents were killed in the war. A tenth of Belarusia's 300,000 war orphans were lodged in 265 children's homes, like the Detski Dom number 8 in Minsk. The greater part of the food, clothing, and other scarce items required for the care of children in these homes was furnished by UNRWA. These Soviet orphans, who will become Soviet workers of tomorrow, are given as much training, education, and fun as an impersonal government can provide. On holidays, which come at least once a month, children are taught to dance and recite for the amusement of the rest. Hopkinson photographed traditional folk dances, which are often based on agricultural themes like planting potatoes. An opportunity to entertain is given to even the smallest and shyest of the children. No film today can penetrate fully the closely guarded secrecy of the land of the Soviets. But to the world at large, no problem is more urgent, no people more worthy of study than the Russians nobody knows. Time marches on.